What's up, guys? Welcome to the Awesemo.com NFL lineup recap show presented by No House Advantage. Man, week 12, that was a wild one, and we got the perfect guy to help us break down exactly what happened. Adam, Scherer. Adam, how you doing, man?
Doing pretty well. Had a decent day yesterday, so broke up a nice losing streak for me, so that was nice. But definitely more excited to talk about this slate than I was last week, that's for sure.
That's awesome, man. I look forward to seeing some of your exposures. This is funny because, like, sometimes obviously if things go horribly wrong, there's still the same number of guys winning the money. It's just that it feels like maybe it was harder to get the winning combo, but we know that someone did, so it's always fun to take a look here. Overall, was there anything that stood out to you about week 12?
I thought that it was a week where there were just a lot of like really, really similar plays coming in. And I always like weeks like that because it just makes it easier to go against the field and be contrarian, as opposed to, like the week before where I kind of felt like, I had to play a bunch of Jeff Wilson. I had to play a lot of AJ Dillon and stuff like that. So that was kind of my approach going in, and obviously ended up working out with a lot of the really popular pieces busting. But one thing that I did notice, and I think you mentioned it in the tweet you sent out right before the show, was that stacks still kind of sucked. Like for me, it really hurt because, like, for example, Carson Wentz was my highest owned quarterback, but I paired him with Pittman, I paired him with Hilton, I paired him with Pascal, and they all pretty much, like, Hilton caught a touchdown, but they all pretty much did terrible. So it was a situation where it's like, oh, cool, I nailed the quarterback, I nailed a bunch of pieces around them, and then my stack still let me down. So the weeks like that, I think, are always really difficult for like 150 max players or experienced players in general to win, because I think typically as a rule, we're correlating our lineups a bit more. So when correlation doesn't come through, it makes it really tough to have a good lineup.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to have a week where, like, pretty much none of the stacks came through for us, but you didn't stack up once with T.Y. Hilton and Jack Doyle. What were you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I had Hilton. I think I had like 2% Doyle or something. I definitely didn't have dueling. Yeah, but none of them came together the right way, I guess.
Oh man, yeah. I was really heavy on some of the cheap stacks, and those just went horribly wrong. Yeah. So before we get into all the plays from last week, make sure to give us a thumbs up on YouTube. And if you haven't already subscribed, make sure to do that so you can keep up with all of our shows. And on the site, we have a lot of free content for you to use if you're not already an Awesemo member. We have the Monday Night Football player rankings, the NBA main slate ownership projections, and the NHL player rankings. Plus, every day we have the NBA deep dive written by Adam that has a breakdown of the full slate. So make sure to check those out on the website. Let's start off by taking a look at the Millie Maker winner lineup. So this week, Tommy Mac, 84 with 21 lineups, managed to get the W here. Matt Stafford as quarterback. That's kind of surprising to me because obviously the Rams had a bit of a slow day, but he got there. Odell Beckham Jr. That was really the play that made it work. And how did you feel about the Rams stack?
Yeah, I didn't get to much of it. I thought it was pretty difficult. Like, I thought when I did the show with Josh, I mentioned Stafford as an interesting tournament quarterback because he was so low owned. But I thought the issue was going to be, who do you pair him with? Because Cooper Kupp was so expensive and Stafford wasn't cheap. And so, like you had said at the beginning, you like cheap stacks. I did too. I didn't think there was a ton of really good cheap value at running back or wide receiver. So I liked paying down at quarterback, and it's made it tough. Obviously he didn't use Kupp. He used Beckham and he used Henderson, which, I think made some sense. Beckham, $5K, a reasonable price tag. Henderson was pretty cheap as well. So I liked the Rams in the sense that they were low owned, and we know that they're a high powered offense. I also just thought they were really difficult to get to, and I preferred some other spots.
Agreed. Yeah, I thought Green Bay definitely had the potential of a shootout. It looks like he didn't go with the run back though. So
Yeah.
Cup always a tough fade if you have Stafford, and the game was a weather game. The winds were 15 miles an hour and it was about 35 degrees. So a lot of factors making it a little bit tough to get to the Rams, but that just meant less people had him. Odell Beckham Jr. was a really interesting play because Ben Skowronek was out for that one. He had been the WR3 previous game, so I thought Odell Beckham Jr. was a nice play. Now, the running backs, Fournette, it seemed like nobody got to Fournette last week, which was a little bit surprising. We had a much higher projected own than he ended up coming in. So, what do you think people saw in Fournette that they were staying away?
Yeah, my guess is just that he was locked out by people's rules because, like, we know people were going to Godwin, we know people were going to Evans. I don't know if maybe it was just, like there's a lot of people that just don't play Fournette with those guys, or if it was just they, had difficulty getting to Fournette at that salary when they were, paying down for Miles Sanders or whatever they were doing. But I don't know. That was a spot where on DraftKings, I ended up being overweight. On Yahoo, I was underweight on Fournette. So it wasn't like I thought it was, a great spot or anything, but on DraftKings, I thought he made a lot of sense, and I was kind of surprised he was as low on as he was.
Same. I wonder if it has to do with the fact that Gronk was so high on. Maybe
Right.
people didn't like pairing them together. Gronk, I think he was the highest owned on the slate at 36%, which oh shoot, I forgot that. Okay, so the ownership on the Millie Maker on Fantasy Cruncher isn't quite accurate because they don't import every single lineup, but very high owned still. Um, and then Joe Mixon, it seemed like everyone's been loving the Bengals stack recently. Mixon came in at 11%, which seemed pretty average, but um, I can't remember. Like, I feel like there were some running backs that everyone wanted to play last week, and it seems like Tommy Mack faded them.
Yeah, I mean James Robinson. So like I have the slant ownership up, and it's not the same as the Millie, obviously, but it should be directionally right at least. Robinson was 26%, Sanders was 26%, McCaffrey was 25. So you had a lot of ownership going to those guys, and that's kind of why I thought it was a fun slate. Was you had those guys were obviously good plays, but you had Joe Mixon, you had Fournette, you had Jonathan Taylor, you had all these other running backs that were strong plays as well that were just getting a lot less ownership.
Oh my goodness. Michael Porter expected to miss the rest of the season. Jeez.
Yeah, back surgery
Wow.
again.
That's disappointing. But I'm sure a lot of you guys are NBA fans, but we'll stick to NFL mostly here. Okay, so Jalen Waddle. It seemed like not many people were on him this week, I guess because the price went up, but still in a good spot as wide receiver one, Carolina. Hope it was a slow team, but he got there in spades. It seems like he was really one of the plays, in addition to Fournette, that was kind of mandatory on a slate where wide receivers maybe didn't have the best performance. How do you feel about Waddle?
Yeah, I had a lot of him too. I thought that he made sense. Just he like you said, the salary came up a little bit, but he was still cheap. He's still heavily involved offensively. I thought that he's kind of another example of kind of how weird the slate was, though. Like when you have a cheap Tua and then you have Waddle go for 31.7 points, you would assume that Tua is like a tournament winning quarterback, but he wasn't. You had Jasicki get shut down in that game as well. So it kind of ended up, you needed him as a one-off. Like the stack didn't really get you there. But yeah, I thought that was another one where he was really low owned, even though yeah, maybe he didn't like project quite as well as some other receivers, but the range of outcomes was still favorable. The ceiling was still certainly very high. So he was another guy that I thought was a really good play in tournaments.
Agreed. Yeah, especially because the wide receivers in the mid range were a little bit tougher to get to. Now, Robbie Anderson is a name I'm shocked to see in the Millie Maker winning lineup because he didn't even do that good. He got 2.5 points. Honestly, like that's probably what everyone expected because he's been having a really slow season, and switching to Cam Newton probably isn't that big a help. But any reaction to a dud being in the lineup? We saw last week with Tommy Tremble, and now Robbie Anderson is the key. Just you play Panthers players, and the thesis is who you can get around them.
Yeah, exactly. It's I mean, it makes sense, I guess, just because so many stacks did fail and such a high percentage of people stack that you don't have to have like the perfect lineup to win those weeks. But still, obviously, very difficult to beat this many people when, especially when it's a receiver. It's one thing when it's a cheap tight end and it's just kind of like, okay, whatever. I was able to get good pieces around them, but the opportunity costs of the wide receiver positions are pretty high. It's not like there were no cheap receivers that did well. So I was really surprised to see him in the winning lineup.
Yeah, that's a shocker. I guess that was the kind of day it was. You didn't need a ton of points to win, 225. It seemed like mostly the running backs went off. But, like, it was a little crazy because I feel like some of the running backs that went off early, like, had pretty good points, didn't wind up in the winning lineup, but uh, finally, he did have one offensive player versus defense, Robbie Anderson versus the Dolphins. So I'm sure a lot of people might have excluded that possibility. Robbie Anderson didn't really help that much anyway, but Dolphins defense versus Cam. How do you feel about that one?
Yeah, I mean the Dolphins, I think we're fine. I personally wouldn't have. So I personally exclude the player against my defense. I also wouldn't have had Waddle with them just because typically if your defense is doing well, like if the other team isn't scoring, it's less likely that you're passing. But also if you get a defensive touchdown, which obviously you're hoping for with your defense, that's a possession taken away from your Jalen Waddle. So on full slates, I typically exclude both of those. On smaller slates, I'm certainly willing to relax it, but it's not something that I think is like necessarily a right or wrong thing. It's just a preference that I have where I would just rather, like, I know I'm playing all of these defenses really. I would rather just, have my Dolphins defenses not negatively correlate with other parts of my lineup. But if you are going to play a player against your defense, I think it is preferable for it to be a wide receiver, especially on full PPR sites, because they can, especially someone cheap like Anderson, he can have a good game just on, 8 catches for 80 yards or whatever. So it's still, it's not something I do, but I think if you're going to do it, that's the route you do it with.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a player versus your defense, but it's just a situation where if you're comparing Robbie Anderson versus another $4,700 receiver, like that'd be a negative that he is going up against the opposing defense in your lineup. But Tommy Mack probably isn't regretting having an offensive player versus defense right now. So congrats to Tommy Mack. All right, let's go to the slant. Let's look at some of the chalkiest plays. And one of the shockers, I guess this wasn't like overly surprising. I mean, we knew this was going to be the chalk defense, but the Texans defense, number one in ownership. On our pro plays tool, we rank players based on how good they are, and they were our consensus number one play. So apparently the field agreed with that. 31% owned. Reaction?
Should never be there. I mean, it's for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, defenses are just so volatile that with a few exceptions, on a 10 game slate or full slate, you just shouldn't have that level of ownership anyway. But especially when it's the Texans, like I understand why it happened. They were, I think, the pretty obvious cash defense. They were 2,300. There weren't really many defenses that stood out as great options this week, so it was really appealing to just throw the Texans in cheap at a cheap price tag against Zach Wilson and the Jets and move on. But that's also kind of just one of the easiest positions to differentiate in tournaments and take advantage of the volatility and hope that, the Texans don't do well and you get on a team that scores a touchdown or two. So really should never have, like, the ownership should never be that high on a defense, especially one like Houston. But I also understand, why people were playing them for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It's not surprising that everyone wanted to play the Texans versus the Jets. They were cheap and facing. I mean, defense is really all about who you're going up against, and the Jets with Zach Wilson have been pretty abysmal. That being said, the Jets did have a 21-point total, so Vegas wasn't totally buying into the idea that they were gonna absolutely go get smoked by the Texans. But yeah, this one didn't work out that great. 6 points at 2,200. Now the next two players, it seems like everyone wanted a piece of this Tampa Bay Indianapolis game because Pittman and Gronk were both very high owned. I feel like whenever you get receivers at like 28 and 29% ownership, you got to be damn sure that they're in a really killer spot. I don't know if this was it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The way I viewed this with Pittman is I thought he was clearly a good play, but like you're saying, whenever you get this kind of ownership going to wide receiver, it's kind of similar to what we just said about the defense. It's not the same level of volatility, but it's still a very volatile position where things can go wrong even in the best spots. So I think that Pittman was over owned for sure. I think like I ended up with more than the field, but the reason for me was I played a ton of very low on Carson Wentz. So I paired him with the low on quarterback and said, all right, I think Pittman's in a good spot, but I'm going to maximize, my ceiling if Pittman has a good game here and, really and get Carson Wentz with him. So I think it's a situation where if I hadn't played a bunch of Wentz, I would have had a lot less Pittman. Like I know you were around half the field. That's probably where I would have ended up if I hadn't played Wentz. Playing Wentz just kind of allowed me to pull him up because I was still getting very contrarian lineups that way.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great way to get leverage on the field is if there's a really popular wide receiver, you go with the quarterback that wide receiver plays for, because if Pittman did have a really big day, there's a great correlation there. And it wasn't a slate where quarterbacks really were like standing out that much from one another. So now Gronk, tight ends, there are fewer plays. And it was a kind of tough tight end slate. So I'm not shocked that he was popular, but 28% ownership. It seemed like everybody kind of gravitated towards Gronk, which was a bit surprising. He paid it off though, 22 fantasy points. How did you feel about Gronk?
Yeah, I mean, it was a good play for sure. I think that he probably shouldn't have been twice as popular as some of the other tight ends, but it was the only game I think on the entire slate with a total over 50. He was cheap. The position wasn't very strong as far as pay up options. You only had Pitts and Kittle. Kelsey was on bye, so that opens up more ownership. So I thought Gronk made a lot of sense. It was a spot where I wasn't playing a lot of Tom Brady. I didn't really want to just be throwing a bunch of very popular Gronk into lineups, but I thought that he made a lot of sense. Like he was a good play for sure.
Nice. And then a couple of value running backs, James Robinson. I think this one was all about the matchup versus Atlanta. I will mention though, Atlanta was, I believe they're favored in this game. So Jacksonville, yeah, Atlanta 23-point total, Jacksonville 22. So I guess it was basically a pick 'em. That's a lot better than your typical game for Jacksonville. Plus, I mean, as far as weather, in Jacksonville, pretty good this time of year compared to other spots. And then Sanders coming back the second week from that injury. I think people expected him to have a huge workload over Boston Scott with Jordan Howard out, but that didn't really exactly happen. So what do you make of Robinson and Sanders? And with Sanders, did we kind of make an error in judgment that we thought he was going to have a bigger workload than he did?
I think that they were both good plays. So like in Robinson's case, it was obvious that it was a good spot for him. He was only 6,200. He should have a big role in that backfield. But it was just an example where, I thought there were a lot of really comparable running backs that you could get to. He was projected for 14% ownership, ended up coming in at 26%. So, at least in the slant where the field is typically a little bit sharper and ownership gets a little bit more concentrated. So, I think it was a good play, but it was also just I didn't think he was, drastically better than a lot of the alternatives. Miles Sanders was one where I think that even if you were concerned about Boston Scott and then you had Gainwell active in place of Howard, he's still so cheap. And we did see, I think it was 16 carries the week before for 94 yards. He was so cheap that there was still a path to success for him. But at the same time, those concerns still existed. And so when you have ownership going to him and you had some other pivots you could go to in that price range, whether it's Ty Johnson or Hilliard, or I think there were a couple of others that they got some ownership. You do want to keep in mind that even though he projects well, there are still question marks there. So it was just a situation where, I thought Robinson and Sanders were good, but at their ownership compared to some other options, there were plenty of other ways to go.
Yeah, that's true. I was kind of on Sanders because I thought he had such an advantage over Boston Scott and kind of Gainwell as far as getting touches, to really run first team, but that didn't really materialize. Obviously, it's tough to know exactly how to rank players every single week, but that one didn't work out.
He also got hurt, I think.
He did. Okay,
I'm not positive. I want to say at least for a while he left the game.
Okay. Well, that makes me feel a little bit better. All right, we'll talk about some of these other guys, but before we do, I want to mention that we have a Cyber Monday deal right now. You get 75% off your first week of Awesemo Plus Platinum when you use the promo code CYBER, all caps, for full access to everything we have, just $750 for the week. So if you've been waiting for a chance to try out all of our tools for NFL, we have player projections, ownership projections, lineup builder, and the boom bust tool for NFL, which kind of gives you the probabilities. We think every player is going to go off, in addition to the top stacks, which kind of gives you the probability that your stack's going to succeed. So if you haven't already checked out awesemo.com premium, this is a great opportunity with promo code CYBER. All right.
Sanders left after 22 snaps and never came back.
Oh, he did. Okay. Well, that makes me feel a lot better. I thought it was just a bad play, but maybe just unlucky. It sucked because Christian McCaffrey also left after the first half.
Yeah.
So just there's only about a 5% chance that a running back gets injured in a game. Maybe with Sanders and McCaffrey, given they've been injured recently, that chance is higher. But is that just bad luck, or what? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing you really can take away from that. Like, it's not like it was McCaffrey's first game back or anything either. So I don't think there's anything, process wise you can take away from guys getting hurt. Same goes for Dalvin Cook as well.
Yeah, it's just a brutal week for the injuries. It feels like we say that every week, but It's like when half of the lineups are going to have one of Sanders and McCaffrey, and then all those lineups are dead. That's kind of tough.
Yeah. The biggest takeaway is just like, that's a reason why, like when you compare ownership in football to like basketball, for example, when someone gets to like 25% in football, you're just like, wow, he's really popular. Whereas in basketball, it's just like, yeah, okay, whatever. It's, the injury risk is one in addition to, just more volatility in scoring. But that is one reason why, you can just play more contrarian in football.
Yeah, it feels like in basketball, the injury risk isn't that high, like compared to what I thought. So like maybe one guy leaves due to injury per slate or something, but not really anything to worry about in basketball. But football, a whole different story. Now we got a couple of popular receivers, Godwin and Cooks. Godwin, I think with you had Antonio Brown continuing to be out for this one, and he came off a big week. 7K though, not the cheapest. And then Cooks was kind of the value option against the weak Jets defense. Neither one of these guys paid off either. So there seems to be a trend here. Only one of the top 10 own players really had a good game. What do you make of the wide receivers that were popular? Because Godwin and Cooks, it seemed like they're in a great spot, but really didn't have much performance to speak of. A really tough slate to nail wide receiver.
Yeah, I think it just goes back to the volatility of the position. It's a volatile sport in general, but even more so for receivers because, running backs, at least they're being handed the ball and you can kind of count on that workload. The ball's going to be in their hands. For receivers, there's the volatility in touchdowns, but there's also, how are they being covered from game to game? That's going to change. Their number of targets is going to change. You have to have the quarterback actually put the ball on them to get the point. So there's just more volatility in general in the position. Godwin and Cooks, I think both were good plays. Godwin, I think, was a little bit easier to get away from just because he was more expensive. Like you said, there were some, cheaper receivers that still gave you a high ceiling. But they were good plays. It is something that I think we've seen this year and kind of seen it across all sports really, but I think it's just the result of, more and more people using quality projections and having access to programs like Fantasy Cruncher or whatever. You're seeing just kind of more concentrated ownership on the best projected plays, even if there are similar players around them that have a similar range of outcomes. So that is something I've been trying to pay attention to a little bit in tournaments, just being more willing, understanding there's going to be kind of bigger swings because more people are on the quote unquote best plays, but that playing contrarian kind of also can pay off a little bit more because you're just getting even more ownership going to one or two individual players at a position.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that Being contrarian in football, definitely interesting, especially given the hit rate of certain positions in football is really low. So wide receiver is one of those where even the best wide receivers maybe 50-50 or a little bit better to get a touchdown in a game. They don't get a touchdown. It's a lot harder for them to make a winning lineup. So uh, I think that contributes to volatility a ton. All right, let's look at some stack ownership here. So we'll filter by QB. Before we do, I want to mention the sponsor of the show, No House Advantage. So it's a DFS site, except instead of picking players, you pick player props. So you're picking a handful of props, and you compete in DFS style contests that award the prize pool for whoever gets the most right. You rate them by confidence level. They give you different points for each prop, and you can get a $25 deposit bonus with a promo code Awesemo. It's a better way to bet props because you're betting against other people instead of the house, and that's going to be a lot easier to win at. So, House Advantage is a great place to get into some more DFS contests, and you can use our projections and the optimal lineup tool to help you take these No House Advantage tournaments down. So, one thing we talk about a little bit on the site, we have the projections on football. They don't have odds on the over or under. So there's a lot of props like rushing touchdowns where the under on a normal prop would be like minus 200. But on No House Advantage, it's just 50-50. So you can get a big advantage on those touchdowns and interception props. They'll give you a good foundation to start with. And the interceptions, you want to go with the over most likely. But they have contests for tonight's game. Make sure to check them out. All right, let's look at the quarterback ownership. We mentioned that quarterbacks really didn't perform very well on this slate, but let's look at a couple of the chalky ones. So Tom Brady, Cam Newton, the most popular. Brady, I mean, fantastic quarterback. I can't really argue with that, but it looks like you didn't have that much. I didn't have that much. So is that just because of the lineup construction?
Yeah, I think it was a situation where I talked about it, I think it was last week with the Dallas and Chiefs game too. Brady, I think clearly was a top option, but the problem was just like, how do you build a Tom Brady stack that is still contrarian? You had a lot of ownership going to Godwin. You had a lot, or at least a decent amount going to Evans. On the other side, you had a lot going to Pittman. You had a lot going to Gronk. So how do I build this lineup where I'm not just playing popular guys in 3 or 4 roster spots, where if Tom Brady does really well, cool, everyone has the same build as me basically. And so that's typically, I'm fine playing popular quarterbacks if I can build some sort of like contrarian stack, like if everyone's playing Godwin and nobody's playing Evans or something. But when ownership's going to every receiver and the number 1 receiver on the other team, and even going to Jonathan Taylor as a run back, it just becomes really difficult for me to get there.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that it becomes a little bit tough with those expensive stacks to make a lineup that you like with the rest of it. So if everyone has that same combo of players, you really got to get a lot of luck going for you with the rest of your plays to get the winner there. Where with the cheap stacks, you can get a little bit more of a solid lineup around them. A couple of the cheap quarterbacks were really popular on yesterday's slate. Cam Newton and Tyrod Taylor, both kind of running quarterbacks that had great matchups. Neither one really did great. I felt like Tyrod Taylor had a good opportunity because he did a pretty good first half, and then it kind of just slowed to a halt in the second half. But the Texans are so bad that isn't exactly a surprise. And then Cam Newton, at one point, he was 5 for 20 in passing attempts. So we kind of knew these guys weren't great when we picked them. But I see you're a little bit down on Cam compared to the field. Was that just because he was too chalky?
Yeah, I think it was just an ownership thing. Taylor, I was okay getting to. You had Brandon Cooks, who you could pair him with. I think I played some Taylor naked as well, which normally I don't do. But it was a situation where I knew that a large percentage of the Tyrod Taylor lineups were going to have Brandon Cooks because nobody really wants to go to anybody else from that team. And he runs enough to where I didn't mind doing that in some lineups. But for Cam, I didn't want to play him naked because I thought that even though he has rushing upside, there were multiple receivers on Carolina you could go to, whether that be McCaffrey, Moore, Anderson. So I didn't want to just like completely ignore all of those guys. But then you kind of run into the same situation where Newton's getting ownership. McCaffrey's really popular. That's obviously, the preferred guy that I'd have him with. DJ Moore was still, I think, around like 10% or something like that. So it was just another situation where, Newton was fine, but it wasn't like he was like a crazy good play, I didn't think. And you had ownership going to him and most of his pieces. So I kind of ended up just looking elsewhere.
Nice. Yeah, I kind of liked him just because he was a great value, bringing that rushing upside. And Christian McCaffrey was a good play. Obviously, that went terribly. So, but Tyrod, it looks like you're a little bit higher on to get that Cooks correlation with Cooks being the a good play and also high on. I like that. It looks like we were both really low on the next most popular quarterbacks: Herbert, Garoppolo, Burrow, Hurts, Cousins. It seems like these were kind of the mid-range guys, excluding Garoppolo, who was a little bit cheaper. But was that more just because you wanted to go cheaper at quarterback?
Yeah, I just thought lineups looked a lot better with cheap quarterbacks. There was obviously upside on guys like Herbert and Burrow and Jalen Hurts. There always is. But, Garoppolo was in a good spot. But their ownership wasn't – it's not like they were getting, for the most part, much less ownership than the cheap guys. And I thought that the cheap guys just kind of gave me better roster construction. I was able to spend up for guys that I wanted at running back or at wide receiver a little bit easier. So I was willing to give up, maybe a little bit of top end ceiling. Someone like Herbert is more likely to just completely destroy a slate than someone like Matt Ryan or Carson Wentz. But I was willing to give that up in exchange for what I was able to get elsewhere in my lineups.
And Matt Ryan, I thought he was a good play at 4.7% ownership, but he only came in at 3%. A great matchup versus Jacksonville, whose weakness is passing defense. So that one seemed like the best play. Like on paper, it didn't work out at all. Looking back, do you feel like that was just bad luck, or was it maybe a trap play?
Even as I made the play, I felt like it was a trap play, but just because I've been on Matt Ryan enough weeks this year at low ownership and he's been absolutely awful. But the thing was, this was kind of the opposite of like what we had talked about with some of these other teams. Cordell Patterson was like 6% owned. I had no issue pairing Ryan with Patterson. Kyle Pitts wasn't super popular given, it was a weak tight end position. I know in the boom bust tool, we had him pretty far under owned. So getting to him made some sense. Gage was fine. He just had, you had a cheap quarterback in a good matchup. Matt Ryan has, his issues, but you had a cheap quarterback in a good matchup with low owned skill players you could pair him with that were also in a good matchup. So it was a spot where I wasn't super confident in Matt Ryan by any stretch, but I thought that it was a very high upside spot given, relative to ownership.
Nice. Yeah, I agree with that. I would have done that again if we did it again. But Zach Wilson also really unpopular. I thought he was kind of a good play because of the matchup versus Houston. Another guy, he got a rushing touchdown, so only ended up with 11 points in a Jets win. So that was a little bit unusual. But do you feel confident that Wilson was a good play yesterday?
Yeah, I don't think Zach Wilson's good, but I don't think Houston's good either. And it was just one of those games where when you get two teams like this, there's always the potential that you just end up with a really ugly game where nobody scores. But you also get some sneaky shootout potential where neither defense does anything and both offenses just go up and down the field. So I thought that Wilson at very low ownership made a lot of sense, especially because you also had some solid receivers to pair him with. Corey Davis was out. So you had Elijah Moore, you had Jamison Crowder potentially as good options. You could run it back with Cooks and be on the contrarian side of that game stack as opposed to the popular side with Tyrod Taylor. So that's another one where, I'd go back to it because it's not that I was playing Zach Wilson with a ton of confidence thinking that, he's going to succeed a huge percentage of the time. It was more so, I think that when he does succeed at this ownership, it's going to pay off really, really well. So the fact that he didn't have a good game isn't really surprising. And I would certainly go back to it, because I think if you could play that slate, 1,000 times, he's going to fail a lot, but he's going to pay it off really nicely when he does well.
Definitely. Now, Ryan Griffin. Damn, how did that guy end up in my lineups? I feel like that must be a bug because of the Jets tight end.
Yeah.
Wow, I need to. If that actually had him, that's a big flaw in my process. I'll have to think about that. Okay, Tua, we were both quite over the field. He was only 1%. I feel like he's a pretty good quarterback as far as like passing volume, and he hasn't had any blowout performances, but we were both, you're 5x, I was 10x. Another guy that it seems like he should have done a lot better given how Waddle did. What do you think?
Yeah, I know on Yahoo, I think I had like 25% or something too. So I was definitely on Tua yesterday, and it was just another one where I thought, I like Jalen Waddle. I thought Gesicki was a good, relatively low-owned tight end option. He obviously didn't do well, but yeah, it's just, I never have a ton of confidence in Tua, but he's cheap. He has playmakers that you can roster at relatively low ownership. I just think it's a situation where you get paid off a lot better with this approach, I think, when it goes well, than you do, trying to win basically coin flips against 14% of the field that stack Tampa Bay.
I agree with that. Yeah. It's been a tougher season for these value quarterbacks. And I didn't exactly have Mike White when he went for 400. That was a little bit too contrarian. But one guy, I'm surprised Tannehill was 0.1% owned. Like, could he be any lower owned? Like, would you have wanted to have him given that his ownership ended up being that low?
Probably not. I don't think that. I mean, yeah, it's like, who are you pairing with? Westbrook, I guess. It just seemed like it was a really not even a knock on Tannehill, just kind of like the lineup as a whole is going to suck. And, yeah, like 0.1% is obviously really low, but I'll take 1% to over 0.1% Tannehill when it means getting Waddle and Gesicki instead of Nick Westbrook and whoever else was playing for Tennessee yesterday.
Definitely. All right, let's look at some contrarian plays. So let's sort by Adam's ownership from highest to lowest, and we'll kind of pick out some low on guys. But before we do, let's talk some Hall of Fame. So guys, if you want to be in this avatar contest, go to awesemo.com/avatar. Make that your icon on any of the fantasy sites. And then if you place top 3 in a contest with over 5,000 people, you can tweet the win to the Awesemo Hall of Fame account and get a free month of Awesemo Plus Platinum. And it's always great to see the success in the community. So let's take a look at the Hall of Fame here. So, all right. Let's a little bit thrown off here. All right. Okay. All right. Eric Lindquist. I've seen this guy's name before. What's the best way to recover from a bad NFL Sunday morning? Have a decent NBA Sunday night. That's always a great way to do it, is you chase your losses. And that really paid off for Eric. He got third for 4K in the NBA slate. So, and he did pretty well on DraftKings as well. So congrats, Eric. I'm sure you guys see him on all our shows. Good to see him on the top of the leaderboards last night. Sean F. Thanks, Awesemo and the whole crew. I was in first for a while and came up short, but nevertheless, a great showing. Shout out to Laffy for convincing me to stick with my guy and play Fournette. He went from $50 to $2,700. That's a killer return. And Fournette was a really good contrarian play. So congrats to Sean. Elway's Army. I feel like I always see this guy in NHL. He finished first in the NHL contest, took down 1,300. A lot of flames there. So he definitely crushed it in NHL. Make sure to check out our NHL shows in the afternoons if you guys are a fan of that. Congrats to Elway's Army. Sean Jeezy. first for 1K in NBA. This looks like it was a couple of nights ago, that triple overtime game. So that was a little crazy. He didn't even need that many players from the Sacramento LA game though to finish first in the mini max. Really tough thing to do given how many entrants there are in that. So congrats to Sean. And finally, Jordan Lockhart still got it. This guy, he's been making a huge run over the end of the year. He made up for a terrible main slate with the first in the night slate NFL showdown and or third in night slate NFL and first in NBA. So ended up coming out with 40K. Not a bad day for Jordan Lockhart. Congrats to Jordan once again. I feel like we're saying that pretty much every day. All right. So I'm sorting by ships or Adam's ownership here. We'll find some low on guys that he had. Wentz, you already mentioned 5%. You had him at 24%, so that was a pretty bold stance. Matt Ryan, David Johnson. So that was a guy that I feel like most people may have overlooked, but a running back in a game versus the Jets, is that mainly the thesis of the play in addition to the price?
Yeah, kind of just throwing stuff at the wall. David Johnson, Ty Johnson had both of those guys just as cheap running backs that had no confidence in, but they let me build a good lineup. Obviously, I wish I'd used Hilliard in that price range instead, but they also correlated with, some of the plays that I was using, we talked before, used some Zach Wilson. So that and some Tyrod Taylor. So I had just pretty heavy exposure to that game in general. So it made some sense to mix those guys in as well. Obviously didn't work out, but it's not going to work out a lot when you're talking about those two.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta get some exposure to some of the lower price guys. So David Johnson as good as any, and then Kenny Galladay. It seemed like that the public was off the Giants yesterday, and that game ended up being a huge dud. But Daniel Jones is pretty popular among like our Awesemo guys in this contest, and then Kenny Galladay, you were pretty on. So was that mostly because Shepard and Tony were out?
Yeah. And I think that it was just a spot where he wasn't expensive. I think I had a little bit of Daniel Jones as well. I know I played some Ingram too. You had Kyle Rudolph out as well. So it was kind of like if the Giants can manage to move the ball, which they couldn't, but if they could, it kind of was a situation where red zone targets sort of have to go to Ingram and Galladay. And so I thought that at low ownership, there was a pretty nice ceiling there.
Marvin Jones, another guy that you were 3x the field on. I was a little bit over. It seemed like maybe that was a run back with the Matt Ryan stacks. So was that just because you needed some Jacksonville player?
Yeah, I actually didn't even realize till right now that I had that much of him. But yeah, it's like who are you going to use? LaVisca was getting some ownership. Robinson had some ownership. Jones didn't. So with how much Atlanta I had, I'm going to just end up getting to any relevant piece from Jacksonville probably.
Definitely. And I like to see that you had 4.5x the field on T.Y. Hilton. I'm embarrassed. I didn't have any. And it wasn't exactly a breakout game, but he did get in the end zone. I assume that was just a stack partner for Wentz, who also was low owned.
Yeah, a lot of Hilton, or more Hilton than I would have ever played, more Zach Pascal than I would have ever played. But yeah, kind of was the idea was, if I'm going to take a stand on Wentz, obviously I'm going to get a lot of Pittman, but I also want to be on the other receivers. I don't want to play a bunch of Wentz and then still not get there when T.Y. Hilton has a big game. Unfortunately, I didn't go the Doyle and Doolin route.
Yeah. It looks like a lot of defenses that were low owned. So that's kind of what you're saying with going with defenses that have low ownership. I assume that those are mostly dart throws.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I view defense in general.
Awesome. And then Ramondre Stevenson, I was surprised he was only 1% because he came off a pretty big week in that blowout versus the Falcons. So he was only 1%. Do you think that the public was too down on him?
I thought it was a situation where there were better plays, but also the ceiling like his median projection didn't quite tell the whole story because you had Damian Harris back. So obviously you can't rely on Stevenson to have a big game, but there's still uncertainty in how they're going to be utilized and who's going to get goal line work. It's going to kind of depend on who happens to be on the field on a particular drive a lot of the time. So it was a spot where, if he were 5-6% owned, I wouldn't think he was that good of a play, but at 1%, I just kind of thought there was a little bit more upside than he was getting credit for.
Definitely. Let's talk about my ownership. I noticed right away Aaron Jones only 2.3% owned. I had 20%. I was just hoping that it'd just be the normal rolls since he only missed a week, but it seemed like AJ Dillon did get more of the work yesterday. It seemed like everyone was playing as if AJ Dillon was going to be the starter, but then Aaron Jones was ruled in. We had up on the site Jones being still in because I felt like it could go either way, but how did he play that one? And I'm trying to find AJ Dillon's ownership because that seems like a key part of the puzzle. Like he ended up being 7%. What do you think of that? What do you think of Aaron Jones being only 2.3%?
I thought Aaron Jones was a good play in tournaments. Like it's not one where I went that route. I ended up right around the field, but I actually I did spend some time sort of thinking about what to do with him when I realized I wasn't getting that much because there was just so much uncertainty there. And I love going to spots like this where the field as a whole basically has just decided that Aaron Jones is like not going to play a big role when really nobody has any idea. So, it just struck me as one of those spots where there was a decent chance that you and I were doing this show today and we're just sitting here like, oh my God, like how was 6K Aaron Jones 2% owned? Like, why did I only play 2%? I ended up just kind of sticking with it and playing a bunch of Patterson and whatever. But that was definitely a spot where I thought if you are aggressively taking those stands over the course of a season, it has the potential to go really well once or twice, which is really all you need over the course of the season. So I think, obviously it didn't work out, but like you knew the risks going in, one, he could not play, but in that case, you're just swapping him to AJ Dillon. So that's not even really a risk. Two, he could just split carries with AJ Dillon, and that's likely, but the upside there is that he just plays his normal role. He gets 3 touchdowns at 6K, and you're just in a fantastic spot. So not again, not a play that I made, but I know you had a lot of him. Looking at some other good players, they had a good amount of him. So I think that is a spot where being aggressive there is just a pretty good spot to be in over the course of the season.
Agreed. Yeah, that one. It seemed like I'm surprised more people didn't try to swap from AJ Dillon to Aaron Jones once Aaron Jones was ruled in, because that was only $100. I'm sure a lot of people could have made that swap, but another guy that was pretty low owned that we were way over on was Cordarrelle Patterson. I assume that was mostly due to the questionable tag, but he killed it. The funny thing is 30 points wasn't enough to be in the winning Millie Maker lineup because the other running backs did so good. But it seemed like we nailed that play. What do you think?
Yeah, I was actually really nervous about that one too. When I saw my exposures, I was like, man, my highest owned player is a running back coming off of an injury in on an offense that kind of sucks, in a backfield where like it could go poorly. But then you kind of just think about the upside there too. And it's like, okay, he's not getting any ownership. It's kind of like the Aaron Jones play, right? Like everyone's kind of just decided that they're safer plays than Cordarrelle Patterson. But the upside is, you have Ridley out. You have a guy that catches a bunch of passes. You have someone that is the best running back on the team as well and is likely to get goal line work. And he's just getting no ownership. So kind of just decided, screw it. If he doesn't have a good game, it won't be the first time I've lost at NFL. But the ceiling was just so high for someone in that price range getting virtually no ownership.
Definitely. Let's close this out by looking at the winners lineup in the slant. So Indiana Billy D, congrats on the 20K. It looks like he ended up going to the Chargers. Herbert, he didn't have any other Chargers players other than Herbert in his lineup. So that's definitely a different approach than most people. It just shows that this how bad the stacks did on this slate. But how do you feel about the fact that he had Herbert and no Chargers receivers?
I mean, it's not something I would have done. It kind of goes back to what, like, kind of when we talked about the correlation or negative correlation from the Millie winning lineup. You can still build high scoring lineups that either don't have positive correlation or that have a little bit of negative correlation, it doesn't prevent that from happening. It just makes it less likely that you do. So the reason that, I'm always stacking somebody like Herbert, or pretty much any quarterback with, like rare exceptions like Tyrod Taylor this week. If Herbert, someone, especially that isn't going to run for 100 yards or something, if Herbert has a tournament winning game, it's just really likely that somebody out of Keenan Allen or Mike Williams or Jared Cook had a good game. And so just put them in the same lineup, and it's making it, you always talk about tournament teams kind of being like a parlay where you have to hit every spot or almost every spot. Just introducing positive correlation makes it so that at least if you get the quarterback right, the chances are better that you got that tight end spot or that wide receiver spot right. So you can still, build lineups that do really well like this one without stacking. It just makes it a lot more difficult to do it consistently.
Definitely. Yeah, and it is I guess there are certain slates where stacking just doesn't work, like this fast one. And there's not a lot you can do, I guess. Like obviously the Millie Maker lineup was still stacked, so that just shows that even though it was really hard to get a stack to hit a lot this week, like the stack lineup still put up the highest score in the biggest tournament. So it's definitely a strategy that doesn't work 100% of the time, but more often than not, you're better off stacking. Anything else that you notice about this lineup?
I mean, the plays I think were fine. Like he did do a good job of mixing in, some contrarian plays. Actually, overall, it was just a pretty contrarian lineup. The only popular piece he had, I guess, was Pittman. But yeah, I mean, Fournette, like if you're not stacking Tampa Bay, Fournette makes sense just as a negative correlation play to the passing game. Obviously, he hit on the Dolphins defense. I thought Freiermuth was fine. I know I was overweight on Jerry Jeudy. I think it's, a bunch of good plays. Just, not the way I would have constructed a lineup, but he made more money than me yesterday too. So
yeah,
who cares?
Yeah, only 7 lineups. So Indiana Billy D really nailed it. Congrats to Billy. So that's going to do it for our recap here, but we have plenty more shows throughout the day. We just had our NFL Showdown strategy show. So if you're looking for advice for tonight's slate, make sure to check that out with Laffy, Matt Kajeski, and former Chicago Bear, Alex Brown. Then we have the NBA shows. You were just on the NBA strategy show, breaking down tonight's games. And then we have fantasy football channel that has our fantasy football show today. So Awesemo Fantasy Football, and then the betting show is on Awesemo Odds YouTube. So if you guys are interested in fantasy football and betting content, make sure to go to the Fantasy Football and Odds YouTube channels. They're different channels. Finally, we got our NBA pre-lock. So we got 2 hours of NBA leading up to the 7 p.m. lock. And then we had actually 3 hours, my bad. And then we have the NFL live before lock, taking all the way up to the Showdown slate lock. So guys, make sure to subscribe. And if on the way out, you can hit that thumbs up button. That gives us a lot of credit in the YouTube algorithm. So we appreciate that. And if you guys just thanks for checking out the show. Thanks to No House Advantage. You can get $25 with the promo code Awesemo. And good luck tonight and this week.